for putting this on, and a special thanks to Philip, who is volunteered to be my glamorous assistant in helping show slides, as we had some problem with that doing that last night. So if we could have the first slide, that would be great. So what I want to do today really is two things. Firstly, to talk about developments that are taking place mostly really behind the scenes in relation to the development of new military technology and how that impacts on peace and security. But also I want to talk about, alternatives, what we can do to enable and encourage alternative thinking about this. Today it almost feels as though there is no discussion or debate about the effectiveness or morality of military security. It kind of seems to be taken as a given, as an article of faith, really, that peace in our world can only be achieved through strong armed force, through an ever-increasing ability to impose death and destruction upon others. That in the face of what, a growing Russian or Chinese threat, we have to have more nuclear weapons, or, in response to the awful terrorist attacks that takes place, we have to invest ever more in deadlier technology, or that in response to Saddam Hussein or Colonel Gaddafi or Abu Bakr Baghdadi or whatever tin pot dictator comes along, we have to sell arms to another equally obnoxious dictator in order to keep the balance of peace. But that's nonsense, I think. And our faith in God and in our faith in humanity demands that we reject that view of peace and security. And I want to say something about that, not in the kind of grand sense of, we must rid the world of nuclear weapons or we must free Palestine, which of course are true. But what can we do as individuals in our communities to increase the peace, if you like, to encourage thinking and discussion about alternatives to military security? So I'll come back to that. But first of all, I want to say, as I said, something about new military technology, and we can have the first slide. The rise in the use of drones has been kind of remarkable. Little more than a couple of decades ago, drones were an obscure technology primarily used for target practice by the Air Force and the Navy. But now they've become virtually central to the way we fight wars. And drones, I would argue, encapsulate how technology is changing the nature of warfare, but also very much part of an attempt to make warfare much more acceptable again. So some argue that there is little or no difference in effect between drones and traditional inhabited or manned aircraft, but there are very real and significant differences. Slide. So first and most obvious, they're remotely operated over very great distances via satellites. And while the drones themselves are located near the point of operation, once they're launched, control is handed over to pilots sitting thousands of miles away. In the case of the UK, slide, at RAF bases in Lincolnshire and Las Vegas. So remoteness is one major difference, but the other one is persistence. And due to a lack of crew on board, drones remain in the air much more longer than a piloted aircraft. So a typical fast jet really can only be in the air for about 8 hours before the crew are too fatigued to be at the peak of their abilities. Whereas drones can fly much longer. So currently about between 20 and 24 hours, and the new drone that the UK is about to acquire can stay airborne for 40 hours. And crews simply change shift on the ground while the drones remain in the air. And it's this ability really to engage in risk-free bombing together with such increased persistence, which allows pilots to look for what they call targets of opportunity, that is seen as this big strategic advantage and strategic difference. And in the time I have, I want to kind of highlight just a couple of ways that this is impacting. Slide. Sorry. So firstly, in modern times, I think, as we all know, there's a real political cost to launching military intervention. Politicians know that the public don't like to see young men and women sent overseas only to come back in body bags or coffins. And TV footage of grieving families or potential footage is a definite restraint on political leaders weighing up the option of whether to launch a strike or launch military intervention. But if you take away that potential political cost by using these remote unmanned systems, it makes it much easier for political leaders to opt to use lethal military force rather than engaging in the often long-term and difficult work of solving the root causes of problems. Slide. Particularly when the populist press is baying for quick solutions to take out bad guys. So secondly, through being persistent in the air, we're seeing drones change the nature of airstrikes. So you need to know that there are basically two types of airstrikes. There are those that are pre-planned. So like tomorrow we're going to go and hit that airbase or that target over there. That's called pre-planned. And then there are dynamic strikes. So that is when aircraft are in the air and a target is spotted. So we're seeing through drones a real increase now in the use of what's called dynamic targeting, dynamic strikes. And I want to mention here a young man called Navid Bullock, who is a 24-year-old from Pakistan, and you won't remember his name, but you remember about 3 years ago now, I think, there was an awful terrorist attack on the Christmas market in Berlin, where a truck was driven into the crowd and 12 people were killed and a large number of other people were injured. And in the aftermath of that attack, several people spotted a young man running away. And they phoned the police and contacted them and followed him, staying in contact with the police on their phones. And they chased him for several miles. Eventually, he was run down and arrested in a park, hiding in a park several miles away. And that was Navid Bullock. But within hours, it was all over the press that the perpetrator of the attack, this refugee from Pakistan, and he'd been captured. But 24 hours later, he was released without charge. And that was Navid Bullock, as I say. But he was able to prove categorically that it wasn't him, but he'd ran away because he was frightened and he saw people chasing him. But if that was a similar scenario in Afghanistan or Yemen or Iraq, and Navid had been running away from an attack there and had been followed by drones rather than members of the public with mobile phones, you can easily imagine, particularly if it had been discovered through intelligence, through tracking his mobile phone, that he'd been from a particular area of Pakistan. He wouldn't have had 24 hours to prove his innocence, and a dynamic decision would have been made and he would have been killed in a drone strike. So targeted killing, again, is another example of how drones are changing warfare. So slide. The US assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani was perhaps the most newsworthy example of this. And the targeted killing of a senior military officer sent shockwaves around the globe and appalled many, and international law scholars were pretty unequivocal in arguing that a strike was unlawful. But what can't be denied is the strike has its roots in and builds on this much expanded culture now of targeted killing that's arisen with the advent of drones. And while Soleimani's killing got lots of attention, many others go almost unnoticed, and hundreds of individuals in a whole host of countries have been labeled as terrorists and hunted down and killed in attacks. But also hundreds, perhaps thousands of civilians, innocent civilians, have been caught up in these strikes too, which receive little media coverage. So the UK continues to operate its fleet of Reaper drones at the moment over Iraq and Syria, launching occasional strikes. And you may remember a couple of weeks ago, there was a flurry of strikes. Even though both Iraq and Syria have declared the war against ISIS to be over. And this is another issue with the rise of drones, the forever war. When there are no troops deployed, there is very little domestic pressure to bring wars to an end. But as well as operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, British drones are now operating outside of that, but the government is refusing point blank to tell us where they are. Slide, please. So there was no announcement about this. We discovered it through our FOI work, but all information is being refused on grounds of national security. And we've had a number of PQs put down, and MPs have written personal letters to the Defence Secretary, all to no avail. So for us, the next stage on this is a court hearing that will take place later this year. But this is another issue with the rise of this technology, remote warfare, is that they're happening in great secrecy now with little transparency or oversight. But many other countries are also now using drones. When I started, it was just the US and the UK and Israel, but now there are regularly many countries. Our last update, we think there are roughly about 20 countries now using armed drones, with another 20 behind them. And there continues to be significant civilian casualties from these strikes. Slide. But operators continue, like the US and the UK in particular, that they don't cause civilian casualties. So as well as this kind of horizontal proliferation around the globe, there is also vertical proliferation, if you like. That is how drones are changing, developing into much more lethal technology, particularly in terms of autonomy. And we argue that drones are very much a gateway to lethal autonomous weapons. In the very near future, the UK is acquiring the latest version of the Predator drone. We have one version at the moment called Reaper, but the next version we're going to be calling Protector. I think they finally decided that, Avenger, Predator, Reaper is not perhaps the most media-friendly name. So we're now going to be calling this the Protector. And it's much bigger, able to take off and land autonomously. But the real difference is that they want to use these systems now in UK airspace. So there's a real push to use them both in the US and in Europe, to use these systems in domestic airspace. And beyond that, the UK is investing in another system, a new aircraft called Tempest, the Future Combat Air System. And at this stage, it's not clear whether it's going to be crewed or whether it will be unmanned or drone. But we're also seeing real rapid developments now in swarming technology and loyal wingman, which is a new type of drone that we're building. So you will have seen in the integrated review that there is real now a big push towards much more high-tech and remote systems for warfare. So I said at the beginning that I wanted to talk a little bit about drones, but also I wanted to emphasize that this increasing use of military technology to solve security problems isn't a coincidence or something that's just happened, but is very much part of a strategy, I think, to rehabilitate the idea of warfare in the public. So throughout the 20th century, warfare, which in previous centuries was portrayed as glorious and heroic, increasingly throughout the 20th century became outmoded and immoral and threadbare. From the slaughter of the war to end all war at the beginning, onto World War 2.0, which killed millions and millions of more people, then the Cold War and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation, and then on to the kind of humiliation, really, of both US and Soviet might in Vietnam and Afghanistan, respectively. Kind of acceptance and support and seeing warfare as heroic and glorious very much declined. But remarkably, here we are just a couple of decades later, and the value and effectiveness of warfare has been rehabilitated, I think. And this is very much due to a strategy. So there are a number of elements to this, as you can see this on the slide. Military interventions now are always framed as being for humanitarian reasons, never for self-interest or geopolitical advantage. So, for instance, the Libyan intervention was framed at protecting the people of Benghazi, and the return to Iraq was portrayed as defending Yazidi refugees. And then, war is now being portrayed as never anymore in the hands of grubby politicians, but is in the hands of detached and independent legal advisors, who are above politics. Then, of course, as Dan mentioned, really, there's the advent of the help for heroes culture, where it's increasingly difficult to critical of the idea of using armed force, unless you're being presented as criticizing the armed forces personnel themselves. And then there is the kind of stoking of the fear of terrorism And the terror attacks that have taken place in the UK, in Europe over the past decade, have undoubtedly moved public opinion back in favour of military response to security. And while the terrorist attacks remain very small, they have a great deal of power to shock and disturb and are very frightening. There's no doubt about that. And they always gain huge media coverage and have led many to the conclusion that there is no alternative, that military security, preemptive use of force, has to be the way. And then again, I think another important piece of the puzzle, as I say, of the strategy, is that there is this focus now on precision, high-tech weaponry, which advocates argue, enables armed force to swiftly and cleanly take out the bad guys while leaving innocent civilians unharmed. So this is the strategy, as well as technology is helping to rehabilitate the idea of war, make it more normal, make it more acceptable. But of course, there are alternatives, and we have to argue those alternatives and argue that we come from a different place. This is not new to any of you, I'm sure, but I mean, like all of us, I think I can remember where I was when the aircraft hit the Twin Towers and the Pentagon in 2001. We all remember that day, almost 20 years ago, very, very vividly. I was with about 1,500 people taking part in a protest organised by Campaign Against the Arms Trade outside the large London Arms Fair, Dicey, that was taking place that year. And many events were cancelled on that day and in the following days and weeks, sports events and political events and cultural events. But the arms fair continued and more deals were made and more contracts signed, even in the light of that mass killing on that day. And whilst the fact that there was a major arms fair taking place in the UK at the very same time as this awful act of terrorism was a coincidence, and of course it was, but there are real, I think, underlying connections between those two things, that despite all the evidence to the contrary, the idea on both sides that human liberation, human salvation, human security, human well-being lies in the ability to inflict death and destruction upon others. Those things have those two things in common. And in stark contrast to that belief, I think, at the heart of our faith, the Christian faith, is that salvation lies not in violence or weaponry, but in following God and being committed to the ways of God. But we know very much that's not the way of the world. Slide. At the same time that Jesus and the early Christians were urging people to love their enemies and extolling the virtues of what we call nonviolent peacemaking, at the very same time, Roman military commanders were writing, if you want peace, prepare for war. So whilst one philosophy, if you like, hails armed might as a means of security, the other argues that real peace and real security lives in the practice of love and the practice of justice. But I said at the beginning that in relation to all this, that I wanted to focus on, well, what can we do? What can we do as individuals, as small groups, rather than the kind of grand strategy? So here are a couple of my suggestions for what we can do to kind of raise the idea that there is an alternative, that armed violence isn't the only way, isn't the way to create peace and security. So slide, if I may, thanks. So this is nothing new. I don't think most people here will be very aware of these things. But I think it's very important that we listen to and hear the voices of the victims of injustice and war and try and stay tuned into that. It's very hard, of course, to pay attention to the poor and pay attention to victims of war. And instead, often people are consumed with the kind of day-to-day lives of celebrities and support stars and Prince Harry and Meghan Markle and all that. But don't get me wrong, I'm all up for spending a few hours watching football. There's nothing wrong with leisure, but we can't, I think, let it drown out what Dorothy Day called the least of these, the poor. But that is very easy to say. It's very easy for me to say it. It's very hard, as we all know, to do it. to listen to the voice of the victims of war is relentless, and it's too much to bear. And I think we can only do it in community, in fellowship, in church. Else, we end up hardening our hearts, as Scripture calls it. So I think our first task, is called to be peacemakers, is to ask ourselves, how can we help our nation and our community and our church and ourselves hear the voice of the victims of war and pay attention to that? Secondly, to hear God's call not to be afraid. And there are many times, dozens of times in scriptures where God tells us and his people not to be afraid. But again, of course, it's very, very hard. We are living through very difficult times at the moment. The terrorist attacks that have taken place in Manchester and in London, they're incomprehensible. The attack that took place in Afghanistan at the weekend, unbelievable. And that fear leads, I think, to hate and to racism and to division, perhaps exactly what the terrorists are seeking. So instead, we mustn't be afraid. I think it isn't a matter of being heroic, but about not letting that fear and that division overcome us and overwhelm us. And, we are in a, post-Brexit, in this kind of period of time, where there is lots of demonizing of refugees and asylum seekers. And just to say refugees and asylum seekers are part of God's kingdom and deserve a share of God's bounty and our resources and riches as a country is very hard to say at this moment, but it needs to be said. So the second question, I think, is in what ways can we respond to God's call not to be afraid in our lives and in our communities, and just to speak out? It's very hard, but I think if we do it together, it makes it easier. And then, of course, keeping the faith. Sorry, I'm aware of the time I'm going on, but wherever in scriptures where Jesus confronts, a spirit of domination and a spirit of division and destruction, there's a call to commit ourselves to believe in the God of life, that all of us have life and shall live it to the full. Yeah, again, as I already said, we know very much in our society, in our world, some people have much more than others. And in the face of these huge problems, it's very easy to become dispirited, to feel helpless and hopeless. And I think we all struggle with that in our small group, reflection group. We were talking about this just earlier. And it might be one of the challenges, the greatest challenge is just to keep faithful and not to give in to the myth that says, this is the way the world is and it will always be, to this idea that injustice and poverty and war are kind of natural, are human. People say that, or even blasphemy, people say they're just acts of God. We've got to resist that and stay faithful to our different vision, that swords will be beaten into plowshares, that everyone will sit underneath their vine and fig tree. So keeping faithful to that call, and how can we help ourselves and our community do that in our daily lives? And then, challenging the causes of violence. I mean, this is something that all of the people here know, that, that it isn't just about relieving the suffering from the causes of violence, or, shouting on governments, you must do something, but how can we ourselves challenge the causes? And we're all very much aware that the arms trade is a huge cause. And I think all of us, have to be involved, and I'm sure many of us already involved in organizations helping to challenge the causes of violence and warfare in our world, whether that's, Campaign Against the Arms Trade or CND or any of the other myriad of organizations that are there. But then finally, and I was challenged about this in my talk last night, the final is prayer. And, prayer, as I think we all know, is desperately important, vital, both for us as individuals in terms of keeping going and keeping going, but also in terms of community. And without prayer, perhaps we are lost. And one of the authors that I really like is Ched Myers, and he writes very much to pray is to resist the despair by which the powers rule in our hearts and in our worlds. And I think that's a lovely thing. To pray is to resist the despair by which the powers rule in our hearts and our worlds. So my final question, and I've spoken far too long, apologies for that, but how can we help our community and our church and ourselves pray more for peace? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to just move on to having some questions now. I'm going to stop recording so that people feel